Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Angela and today I want to transmit to you guys on part 3 of my series Ascending the Matrix, and today we are going to talk about freedom from bondage. So what is bondage? Bondage is essentially suffering. It's the things and ideas and concepts and realities that are born of ego and that keep us chained to our own suffering and keep us chained to infinite incarnation cycles throughout the matrix in order to evolve our consciousness. But for many of us, it takes a lot longer to do this than it really should. And that's kind of the reason for this teaching, because I want you guys to be able to learn these lessons early on, or at this point in time, so that you don't have to keep coming back to learn the lessons over and over again, because your bondage and your suffering keeps you from being able to transcend the ego. So what is suffering? What causes our suffering? Most of us know suffering pretty intimately. If you have an ego and you live on earth, you are most likely enduring some sort of suffering. And suffering can be things like addiction, codependency, anger, depression, causing other people pain, service to self, things like that. Things that are of a negative vibration, that don't make us feel good, that don't serve others, that are very self-serving, whether we're conscious of it or not. But also the struggles that we have that we are not able to overcome in a specific lifetime. This mode of suffering can really keep us chained and bound to endless incarnation cycles in the matrix if we don't overcome it. Because if we don't overcome it in a specific lifetime, we usually feel the need to have to come back and do it again so that we can evolve our consciousness, because we choose certain karmic cycles and certain lessons in order to evolve as a soul. So if we don't do that in a specific lifetime, because we're not able to surpass victim consciousness or poverty consciousness or service to self consciousness, then it can just create this endless cycle of suffering and incarnation and suffering and incarnation, which does slowly evolve your consciousness every time. But you can speed that process up and get a lot more done in one lifetime versus 20 lifetimes if you're able to cultivate a certain level of awareness. So in order to really understand how this process works, you kind of have to understand both sides of the coin. So that means the other side of the veil, the non-physical form, our soul form, versus our incarnated ego form. So when we're on the other side of the veil, we are in pure love and light. And what we want to do as souls, because we are all fractals of the God source that has fractured itself out into the universe, and it's in this process of bringing itself back into wholeness, into oneness as the complete source, with this level of completely understanding itself and its own nature. So we are the process of this evolution of both source's understanding of itself through our own individual understanding of ourselves. So when we're on the other side, we make these plans for incarnations and we say, okay, I'm going to create the karma for myself. Like, I'll use my own personal experience. In this lifetime, I'm going to create the karma for myself to suffer through victim consciousness, through chronic physical pain, through narcissistic abuse, through poverty. And poverty and victim consciousness is a big part of my generational bloodline karma and curses that has to be overcome and transmuted. So I took on a karmic contract to come in and suffer in order to evolve my own consciousness, but at the same time to be able to transmute victim and poverty consciousness in my own family line. So when I transmute my own victim consciousness and my own suffering, I also clear it in my entire family line, because I set an example of my family for my family and I say, this stops here. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to change this dynamic. And when I change the dynamic of suffering, when I change my consciousness from victim to survivor, then I transmute that in my family line, because when I have children, I pass that consciousness on to my children instead of passing on the destructive victim and poverty consciousness. And people can pass this consciousness on from generation to generation. So for me, that was a part of the karmic contract that I took coming into Earth this time, which I have been able to overcome in a big, big way, but I had to endure almost 40 years of suffering in order to get there. And a lot of people don't really reach states of enlightenment until around midlife, around mid-30s and up. Some people awaken sooner, but for the most part, a lot of us usually have to suffer for quite a period of time before we are able to reach a level of awareness to actually become awakened to what's happening and to be able to overcome it. So when we get caught in, say I take on this karmic contract in this life to overcome victim consciousness, but I get so caught up in the victim consciousness that I'm not able to overcome it. And if I don't overcome it in this lifetime, then I will most likely want to come back in the next lifetime to try and overcome it again, maybe try a different approach. But we do this because once I have overcome this consciousness, then my soul is able to evolve to the next level. So if you're coming in and you're living lives, but you're not overcoming your karmic challenges, then you're just kind of stuck in this cycle of not necessarily having to come back and do it again, but wanting to come back and do it again, because especially in 3D Earth incarnations, we are able to endure a lot of suffering as a result of our ego, but we are able to evolve our consciousness extremely quickly. So that's why Earth is a big choice for a lot of people, or other 3D type planets where it's very heavy density, where we have the ego, because the ego creates that suffering for us, and that is how the ego serves us. And I know that that seems strange, but it's through our suffering that we are able to evolve our consciousness and evolve our soul. Because when we endure enough suffering in the physical, then we reach higher levels of consciousness, because it kind of jerks us awake. So we all have these karmic contracts that we come into. We all choose our karma before we're even born, and we say, this is the suffering that I'm going to endure as a result of my ego in order to evolve my consciousness. So we incarnate, we forget that that's what we planned, and we begin to endure ego-induced suffering. How long this takes before we reach levels of awakening or breakthroughs in our consciousness really depends on us and how we endure the suffering and how we perceive the suffering, but also how we are able to overcome it. So we do this as part of our growth process, and I know a lot of people might be like, why would we choose to suffer? But it really just is the easiest way to get from point A to point B, as unfortunate and unpleasant as it is. But as souls, our lives on earth are extremely temporary. It's a blink of an eye in the bigger picture of things, and the growth that we get from the experience is magnificent and beautiful and completely worth every ounce of suffering, as long as we are able to overcome it. But what's happening, or what happens to a lot of humans especially, is that they aren't able to overcome the suffering in a lifetime, either because they're not ready or they're not willing. And so they can end up repeating cycles for many, many lifetimes and suffering a lot longer than they really need to. So the reason I want to share this transmission and teaching with you guys is because I want you to learn how to transmute and end your own suffering, and to free yourself from the bonds of the matrix and the endless reincarnation cycles, so that you can move on to bigger and better things in the higher dimensions, which is what we all want to do. So how do you end your suffering, you might be wondering? Everyone's situation is unique. Everyone chose a different form of suffering to endure in this lifetime, so it's going to be very specific and unique to you. But chances are you know what your suffering is. And so once you're able to create an awareness of how you're suffering or why you're suffering, you are able to become aware enough to free yourself from it, because you'll be able to get a different perspective on it. So one of the main things that keeps us suffering in the matrix is the service to self, that the ego creates this identity that says everything is about me. I want happiness. It's all about me. How do I serve myself? How do I make myself happy? And this service to self consciousness is going to keep you suffering. It is going to create endless suffering for you, which is part of the process. And if you're there, there's nothing wrong with that. But maybe I can plant a seed of awareness to help you overcome that a little bit sooner. So when we experience ego-induced suffering because we are trying to serve ourselves, then we must learn to transmute that perspective into how can I serve others? Because when we are serving others, we are transmuting our own suffering. So nobody who is serving others from a place of love and joy and empathy is going to find themselves suffering, at least not as much as those who are suffering from their service to self, ego-induced delirium and unconsciousness that they are living in. So like I said, it's really hard to generalize it because it is so specific to the soul that it's difficult to generalize it, but I'm going to try to do the best I can to explain this in a general term. So the best way to overcome our own service to self-suffering is to change our perspective and our consciousness from me, to how can I serve others, because the spirit of the light is always about serving the collective and serving others. And once you're able to shift your consciousness in that direction and focus your energy not on yourself, but how you can help others, how you can make the world a better place, how you can speak your truth and be your most authentic expression, is going to really, really cut a lot of those chains of bondage to the matrix. The other way that we are able to overcome our own suffering is to evolve our consciousness. And this means to learn the lessons that our suffering is trying to teach us. A lot of us can really get stuck in victim consciousness and feel like life is hard, life is horrible, there's all these bad things going on all the time, all this bad stuff is happening to me. And so what you really need to be able to do is gain a perspective on, what is my suffering trying to teach me? Like for me personally, my suffering with the narcissist was teaching me self-love. My suffering with poverty consciousness was teaching me how to stand on my own 2 feet and be independent and cultivate my own stability. Suffering from codependency was another issue of self-love. And so there's a reason, there's a lesson, there's something to be learned and something, growth to be had from every ounce of suffering that you endure. The key is to cultivate the awareness to be able to identify what that lesson is, what you're supposed to learn. And if you can do that while you're still in the physical, while you still have the ego, while you still have the density and the confusion and the chaos of everything that happens here, you have made massive strides in your soul's evolution. But we also must understand that everyone is in a different place. There are different levels of consciousness. There are layers. There start from the very, very unconscious, and we gain levels of consciousness through many incarnations. It's not something that's achieved in one lifetime. It's a successive number of lifetimes, and this successive suffering that creates a new level of conscious awareness with each lifetime, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. Even on these lower, completely unconscious levels, people that are completely in ego and believe that they are their ego, even they, when they're unaware and unconscious, when they die, of course they're like, this is what we learned, what we didn't learn. But the ultimate goal is to be able to become awakened and self-aware and to disassociate from the ego personality in the flesh. And once you've reached these levels of consciousness, you're getting very, very close to ascending the matrix. That means essentially graduating this school of hard knocks, you could say. So, and then we can graduate into higher densities. But as we go through this succession of lifetimes and we endure all this unconscious suffering, and then we kind of reach this higher level where we start to become more aware of our suffering, then we know that we're getting close. And if you are lucky enough to be awakened in this lifetime, it means that you are very, very close to the end, because the idea is to become awakened, to become fully conscious, to become fully aware of who you are, and to be able to see through the illusions in the flesh, in the physical form, and then not only be able to become awakened, but to become somebody that can serve others in a way that helps others in their suffering and evolve their consciousness. So what we want to do in this lifetime, a great place to really start if you haven't already achieved this, is to be able to cultivate your own level of self-awareness and be able to learn how the ego works, how the universe works, and to kind of learn how all of this stuff works together and creates this big picture. So from a lower level of consciousness, we can look at the earth and say, there's nothing but suffering and pain and loss. But once you achieve certain levels of enlightenment and self-awareness, you're able to get these much higher perspectives that the reason all of this suffering is happening is because this is how consciousness evolves. And humanity goes through this process of freeing themselves from their own suffering by evolving their consciousness. And if you look at our history, you can see this very clearly. Look how our consciousness has evolved over the past 2,000 years. Look at what we used to do 800 or 900 years ago compared to how we live our lives now. You can see how humanity's consciousness has evolved, but it did not evolve without suffering. And so in order for us to reach this enlightened state of being and these higher frequencies as a collective, we must endure suffering both individually and as a collective. But we do not have to suffer in any life if we can cultivate the self-awareness to be able to overcome our suffering and to learn what it is that we are supposed to learn from the suffering. And if you can learn the lesson, you can apply it in your life and you can make use of it, then you get to graduate to the next level of consciousness. And the higher levels of consciousness you reach, the more joy and love that you find, because as you leave these heavy densities behind, as you transmute these dark, dysfunctional belief systems and ego-induced suffering situations that the ego gets us into, then we are able to overcome the obstacles in our way. Once you learn the lesson, the suffering ends. So the more you learn, the higher levels of consciousness you reach, the less suffering you have to endure to learn and to evolve. And then you finally reach a place where you no longer need to learn and evolve through suffering. You switch gears and you begin to learn and evolve through serving others. And once you get to that place where you're in this vibration of service to others, self-awareness, and understanding and seeing through these illusions of the matrix, then you are really reaching these higher levels of being and consciousness. And this means that you are incredibly close to evolving past incarnations in the matrix, and you get to move up into higher densities, 6th densities, 7th dimensions. Like, you move up in your consciousness, and in these higher levels of consciousness, it's about serving others, not serving self. So the graduation point is when we switch from me to how can I help you? How can I use my pain to help you ease yours in any way, in the smallest, most insignificant way, can have a huge impact on someone else's consciousness. So this is where we ultimately need to get to individually and as a collective. And when we reach this level of service to others, this is what love is. This is what the light is. This is what divine is when we're coming from a place of love and service to others versus fear and service to self. And this is where humanity is striving to get to. It's a slow process. There's a lot of suffering involved, but it's absolutely a necessary part of this journey. So individually, I'm sorry, but my face is itchy today. individually, we have to transmute our own suffering. And when I transmute my suffering, I transmute suffering in the collective. And this is eventually how we free ourselves from our own suffering. When we are able to release the ego-induced mind, fear, density, and we are able to reach this lighter frequency. So what we want to end up doing is we want to become self-aware. We want to become aware of what our karmic challenges are and how to overcome them. And then we want to free. In doing so, we free ourselves from our own suffering. Once we have freed ourselves from our own suffering, we can begin to serve others and to help free others from their suffering. And this is also a process of conscious evolution as well, just on a higher level. So those in the lower densities are learning from service to self and suffering. As we graduate to higher densities, we learn from service to others and non-suffering. Like, we don't need to suffer anymore. We learn through serving others. And so this is what we want to get to. And this is essentially how we get there, is to become aware of what's causing your suffering, because it's karmic. I can guarantee you that. It's something that you planned to suffer before you even came in. So look at what is causing your suffering and learn how to overcome that suffering. And when you do, you free yourself a little bit more. And as you start cutting these chains of suffering that are keeping you stuck in the matrix, that are keeping you miserable, that are keeping you angry, and that are also keeping you from having to incarnate again and again and again because you're just not getting it, you can really speed up this process by cultivating self-awareness and freeing yourself of those chains of that bondage. So I hope that made sense. It's a complicated thing to try and explain. I try to simplify it as much as I can. I have no idea if anyone will even understand that, but if you do, leave a comment. If you don't, leave me a comment too, and I'll try and clarify. But like I said, it's so individual to each specific soul. Each soul has their own reason for enduring the suffering that they choose, for creating the karma that they create. And, you know, it's hard to put it in a broad sense, but I hope that makes sense. So I love you guys. Keep fighting the good fight. I see beautiful, wonderful things happening in humanity right now. I see so much conscious evolution happening, and this is what we have been waiting for and talking about. We've known that this was coming. We've known that this was going to happen. And, you know, people on lower levels of consciousness may see it as calamity and suffering and misery, but those of us on the higher levels who understand suffering and consciousness also understand that this is a fantastic move for humanity. This is really pushing humanity forward and evolving humanity's consciousness as a whole, which is beautiful and wonderful, and I'm so happy to see it. And, you know, suffering sucks. We all hate it, but what's on the other side of suffering is freedom. Freedom from bondage. So I love you guys so much, and I'll see you next time.